Hey guys, today we're in the book of Leviticus chapter 6. Remember, the first 7 chapters are about the sacrifices. And so we have seen the burnt offerings, the grain offerings, the peace offerings, the sin offerings. We've seen the trespass offerings. We saw the guilt offerings. And today in chapter 6, we pick up off of chapter 5, where it's talking about the guilt offering. So it's going to give us a few more reasons why somebody should give a guilt offering. If somebody, in verse 2, if anyone sins, commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor, if he has found something lost and lied about it, swearing falsely, if any of these things people do and sin thereby, if he has sinned and has realized his guilt, then he will restore what he took by robbery. So here we see if you have lied against your neighbor, if you have had theft against your neighbor, if you've deceived your neighbor, you would have to do a guilt offering. And once again, like yesterday in chapter 5, that a guilt offering is that you pay back. Plus, we see in verse 5 and add a fifth to it. So you have to pay back everything that you stolen or lied about, plus a fifth. Plus, you also had to take a ram, or its equivalent in silver. So you can see, as God's setting up a sacrificial system here, there was some steep penalties to be paid. If you stole something, not only would you have to give it back or pay it back, but then you'd have to give 20%, plus you would have to go sacrifice a ram or its equivalent of silver. So there's a lot, but we still have, like all the other ones in verse 7, he shall be forgiven. There is assurance. If somebody did something wrong, and they confessed it and they paid the sacrifice, paid back the restoration, then he would be forgiven. He was given assurance. Now, starting in verse 8, as you're reading this, it might have seemed weird, but I think I can help you understand this. The rest of chapter 6 is giving a little bit more information of the previous 5 chapters, okay? And what happens is they're going to be going back and talking about like a burnt offering, a grain offering, a sin offering. But these are specific rules to the priest, right? We've already read what a normal Israelite, would have to do to sacrifice that. Now, God is giving certain rules and parameters to the priests themselves who are doing the sacrificing. Okay, so somebody does wrong, they bring it to me as a priest, and now God is giving me some rules as a priest that I must do if it's a burnt offering, if it's a sin offering, if it's a grain offering. All right, so let me help you understand this. Verse 8 through verse 13 is all about the burnt offering, right? What should a priest do in the burnt offering? And notice what they have to do. It says in verse 9, they must keep it all night, and then they must keep it burning. And you'll read that several times. One of the priest's jobs is that there was their job to never let the fire go out. Okay? They never let the fire go out. It could always be a time that you would need a sacrifice. So they always had to keep it burning. Verse 12, it shall not go out. Once again, you see this. So in a priest, even though they're doing the burnt offering, which is where in chapter 1, if you remember that, they consume all of the animal, it was a slow burn. It wasn't a quick burn. It was slow. Started in the night, went to the morning, and then somebody was always on fire watch, keeping that fire going, making sure everything went well. Verse 14 to verse 18 is about the grain offerings. And these are what we found in chapter 2, the grain offerings. And so we read all this, and basically, if you read this, it's very much the same as chapter 2, but notice verse 16. And the rest of it, Aaron and his sons shall eat. It shall be eaten unleavened in a holy place, in the court of the tent of meeting, that they shall eat it. And then we see at the very end of verse 18, whatever touches them shall become holy. Now, let me explain this. In the grain offerings, the priests were allowed to eat. Remember, they would take a hand of the flour, they would burn it, they got to keep the rest. But they could only eat it inside of the court of the tabernacle, right? So they could only eat it inside the court of the tabernacle. Who can go in the court of the tabernacle? Only holy men, only the priest. So this was not used to feed the priest families. This was used to feed the priest. Some of their sons who were of age and were learning to become a priest could come in there, but they had to stay within the courts of the tabernacle to eat that bread, to eat that flour. And then it says, whatever touches them shall become holy. Right? So if it's given to God and is burnt to God, that becomes holy. And so it's saying whatever touches this flour will become holy. It's not saying that if a person touches it, they'll become holy. It's saying that whatever touches it must be holy. So, for example, if you were going to take flour and you were going to cook with it, and you were going to take a spoon and grab some flour, throw it down, and cook with it, that spoon must be holy. The container that it is must be holy. Now, we'll find out later how does that happen, and it's all about washing. They just have to ceremonially wash them. They can't be dirty, right? So they have to be clean. And so it's just saying whatever touches that flour, and even after a bread, if it's laid on a plate, it's got to be holy. And so treat this flour as though it is holy. That's what it's referring to. Verse 19 through verse 23 is still about the grain offering. But if you remember way back, right, it's been a couple days, in Exodus chapter 29, and then we'll see in Leviticus chapter 8 in a couple days, when a priest was anointed, when a priest said, hey, I'm going to be a priest, and they had to do some special anointing, right? Remember the blood on the ear, the little toe, the hand, you remember the thumb, you remember all of that? The special anointing to anoint them to be priesthood. A part of that anointing was a grain offering. So verses 19 to 23 is about these priests in a very special ceremony at a very special time. It only happened once in their life, that offering. And so during that offering, there was some things that had to happen. And it's pretty much all the same that happens, a tenth of the flour, all the things that we've tongued. But notice what it says in verse 22. We get one more piece of information, that the whole thing must be burned, right? So remember, you would take a grain offering, they would take a handful and they would give it, they get to eat the rest. But a grain offering that would anoint a priest, they would take a handful, they would burn it, but the rest of it would also be burned, because this is the holiness. This is their forgiveness. This is all to God. So a priest could not eat, or any priest could not eat, a grain offering that was anointing a priest for service. Only the common Israelites that would come and bring a grain offering to God. And then lastly, 24 to the end, this was the sin offering. This is what we found in chapter 4, right? And if you remember, the sin offering, there was one for the high priest. There was one for all of Israel. There was one for a king or a ruler. And then lastly, there was one for a common man, right? They gave us 4 sin offerings. And here it goes on talking about that sin offering. In verse 26, it says, the priest who offers it for sin shall eat of it in a holy place. So here, that is a little bit information we get here that we didn't get in chapter 4, that the priest who's doing the sacrifice, just the one priest, not all of them, just the one could eat of the sin offering. Just one priest, right? You could do that. But then also in verse 28, it says, and the earthenware vessel in which it is boiled shall be broken. If it is boiled in a bronze vessel, then it should be scoured and rinsed in water. So this collection of it, right, this collection, if it was in pottery, that pottery is now holy. And they didn't want anybody, God didn't want anybody to use it, because now the holiness transfers, right? We talked a little bit about that in the previous verses above. So if you have a pottery and it is now holy and you eat everything out of it, what do you do with holy pottery? God says to break it, because it would be bad if a non-holy person touched a holy vessel. It would be a holy act of God. You would be defacing God, and that would bring great sin upon them, even if they didn't know. So if it was pottery, God says just break it so nobody uses it. But if it was bronze, you couldn't break it, right? It's metal. So it says that you'd have to scour it, you'd have to wash it, and then you would have to rinse it with water. You would have to ceremonial clean that. And so now it's a normal copper pot, right? So you have to get rid of that transference of holiness. And then one last thing, it says in verse 30, but no sin offering shall be eaten, from which any blood is brought into the tent of the meeting, right? And we talked about this in chapter 4 with the sin offering. There's 4, right? The high priest, he would have to take blood into the tabernacle. You have all of Israel, they would have to take the blood into the tabernacle. But if a ruler or a king or a common person would bring, they would not take the blood into the tabernacle. So here in chapter 6, we find out that if a common man or woman or a king or ruler, if they bring a sin offering, that the priest can eat of that. The priest cannot eat of the sin offering for all of Israel or for the high priest. That is dedicated all to God, right? So chapter 6 is just giving a little bit more information to what you've already read, but on the priest side, on the worker side, right? It's already given to their side. Now you see this side. It will kind of continue a little bit with this in chapter 7, and then we'll move on to a new section. But you might ask yourself, where is Jesus in all of this? This is weird and just a lot of details. Just think about this. The priest's job was to keep the fire always going, right? Showing that God was always there, that God was always approachable. They could always ask for forgiveness. That was the whole point, right? This fire, anybody at any time could bring something to sacrifice and it would be consumed and given to God. That's what Jesus did for us, right? Jesus put on flesh, dwelt among us, and now we have an intercessor. We have a great high priest in heaven who intercesses between us and God. We have a high priest that sits there and is always there for us, who is always speaking to God for us and about us. And so that flame that always had to keep going, Jesus is that flame. He is God who is always working and preparing things out until the fullness of life. So I hope that makes sense, and we'll see you tomorrow in chapter 7. God bless.